Good morning and welcome to Fiber Broadband Association's Fiber Breakfast. We're now in our 37th episode of 2023. But before we kick off, I'd like to thank Wesco, the platinum sponsor for Fiber Breakfast. Last Thursday, the Senate confirmed Ana Gomez to the open seat at the FCC. So now we have a full contingent of 5 FCC commissioners. The commission has been in a deadlock with 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans since the beginning of President Biden's term in January 2021. So now we have a full contingent. Congress is currently focused on how to fund the government after September 30th. So a lot of activity there. But however, one of the big topics on the Hill this week is on artificial intelligence. So there's multiple hearings being held on the topic, and Leader Schumer continues his roundtable discussions. Our next and final regional Fiber Connect workshop for 2023 will be held in Minneapolis on October 24th. So you're not going to want to miss that. So please register today. These have been selling out. They've been great. And I'm really excited to announce that next week we'll be kicking off our Quantum series at Fiber for Breakfast with our sponsor, Cubatech. So during the next 6 months, we'll be exploring a quantum network topic once a month on Fiber for Breakfast. So that, as fiber enables our quantum future, we want to keep you informed. That brings us today's Fiber for Breakfast session with Jeff Heynen from Deloro, who will be discussing his latest research on setting the record straight on PON equipment trends. But before I formally introduce today's guests, I'd like to introduce Mia from our team, who's going to walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thank you, Gary, and good morning to everyone who has joined us this morning. Before I go over a few logistical items, we'd like to thank the platinum sponsor of Fiber for Breakfast, Wesco. Now, if you would all please keep in mind, all participants are in listen mode only. To ask a question, please type it into the question box located within your control panel on the right side of your screen. We will host a Q&A session with our panelists at the end of today's session. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on FBA's website within 24 to 48 hours. And you can find the recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. At the conclusion of the presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a brief feedback survey. Please take a moment to do so. We appreciate your input. I'll pass it back to Gary to introduce our panelists and get us started. Gary?
Thanks, Mia, and good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the President and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. And last week on Fiber for Breakfast, we had the pleasure of hearing from Angela Seifer, the Executive Director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, to discuss addressing all barriers to digital equity. Angela is doing an amazing job at NDIA, and with the current investment in fiber infrastructure, I believe that we are on the path to closing the digital equity divide. Today on Fiber for Breakfast, our guest is Jeff Heynen from Deloro, who's going to be discussing setting the record straight on PON equipment trends. Jeff is the Vice President of Broadband Access and Home Networking, and he joined Deloro Group in 2018 and is responsible for broadband access and the home networking market, fixed wireless infrastructure and CP, and cable outside plant market research program. Jeff has expanded the scope of the broadband access and home networking areas encompass fixed wireless CPE, virtual CCAP, remote PHY, and remote MAC-PHY, and DOCSIS 4.0 infrastructure. So all the acronyms he's responsible for. He's also authored numerous articles and white papers, and his research and analysis have garnered widespread citations in leading trade and business publications. Furthermore, Jeff is a frequent expert judge and invited speaker at industry conferences and events. So welcome, Jeff. And for our audience, please type in your questions as we go, and we'll work them into the Q&A at the end. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jeff.
Well, great. Thanks, Gary. And it was great seeing you at the Fiber Connect event. And hopefully I probably saw a lot of the attendees there as well, and got a chance to catch up with everybody. So today, at the event, there were obviously a lot of questions, a lot of conjecture around the current state of the PON market and current status of large-scale deployments and where things go, obviously in the context of a record year for 2022 in terms of equipment purchases and fiber network rollouts. And then also, you know, with BEAD and other funding programs still on the horizon or currently in process, you know, where things stand, where do things stand with the supply chains and component shortages, and you know, how do you factor in things like the Build and Buy America programs that are going to be in place for the BEAD program. So all of those questions happened at the show. So I thought I'd follow up from that event and just give a sense of where things are at. As Gary mentioned, we just wrapped up our Q2 report. And so I wanted to share some highlights from that. Next slide, please. So, you know, we just wrapped up the first half of the year. And, you know, as I mentioned, 2022 ended up being a record year for PON equipment spend in North America. You had RDOF and other federal programs and state programs and initiatives that ended up pulling forward some of the spending on infrastructure that was, had guided to be out a little bit further. You still had long equipment lead times. In fact, we are still, some vendors are still facing that, both on the OLT and ONT side. And so as a result, operators began to purchase additional capacity just to be on the safe side so that they had it for their own initiatives. And then by the second half of the year, the lead time started to improve. Equipment started to get freed up and orders were fulfilled. Backlog started to come down a bit. So we started to see orders being filled at a more normalized rate, something that operators and their equipment vendors and suppliers were more used to. So when we look at a comparison year over year between the first half of 22 spending and the first half of 23, almost identical in terms of overall spend. And that's a good thing. It really suggests that, despite all of the challenges that have come to fore here in the first half of this year, it suggests that demand continues to remain high for all kinds of fiber projects in the North American market. So let's go to the next slide, please. Now, what looks to be happening here is, despite the fact that the first half compares well to the first half of last year, it was the second half of 2022 that really showed the freeing up of some of those orders and a really accelerated pace of equipment purchasing, record levels in the third and fourth quarter that we've really never seen before in the North American market, as operators really scrambled to get equipment in-house so that they could deploy that as part of their strategic initiatives for their fiber build-outs. And so for the remainder of this year, I just don't see that type of demand. Certainly, there's this phrase now, of course, of inventory digestion, inventory drawdown, and we're certainly seeing that. I think if you talk to all the vendors in this space, they would concur that that's what they're seeing as well. A lot of that inventory that operators purchased in the second half of the year will be drawn down throughout the remainder of the year. In addition to that, we're seeing some of the larger tier 1 operators reduce their expectations this year for homes passed in terms of their goals. Doesn't change the long-term forecast for them. They still are very much focused on maintaining those homes passed goals and even exceeding them. It just so happens that currently, for many reasons, including delays in locating and permitting, continued labor shortages across the board, and also just waiting for the BEAD program to really begin to flow through to the vendors and the operators. So all of that is creating just this condition where 2023, in terms of spend, will still be at near record levels, but certainly down from 2022. Well, let's go to the next slide, please. And one thing that I think is interesting about the North American market is that really it dominates other regions when it comes to the percentage of total OLT ports that are being purchased that are XGS-PON to support multi-gigabit services. And so what I've done here is I've shown that the ratio of GPON to XGS-PON OLT purchases from 2021 to 2023, and you can see it's essentially flipped, so that the market now, we estimate that by the end of this year, over 60% of all OLT purchases will be for XGS-PON here in the North American market, and that's well ahead of all the other regions around the world. And so you can see that really a lot of the decline this year is coming from the spend on traditional GPON equipment, and of course we expect to see that by 2025, with the BEAD program in place and continued efforts and focus on multi-gigabit service rollouts, I'm expecting that about 85%, if not a little bit more, of new OLT ports purchased in the North American region will be XGS-PON. Let's go to the next slide, please. For this year, of course, there's always a lag time, right, from the infrastructure purchases as the networks get rolled out to when the services get marketed and then subscribers get turned up. And so we always see a lag of 2 quarters to 3 quarters in the very early stages of deployments, and that ultimately reduces to about a quarter. In fact, you'll see in kind of a 1 quarter of OLT purchases, and then the next quarter of the ONT purchases as those the fiber to the home networks get turned up and the services get marketed to new subscribers. So what I think has happened for the XGS-PON ONT market is those units were being rolled out during the pandemic and during all the supply chain issues that we faced and still continue to face to a certain degree. And so the units are behind the infrastructure that's in place. And so there's a lot of catching up that still has to be done on the XGS-PON ONT side. But certainly by 2024, we expect that the XGS units will surpass new GPON unit purchases in 2024. Next slide, please. I think I showed this slide also in my last presentation to this group, but it's interesting to watch the 25 gig capable market continuing to expand as well. And these are worldwide figures here. And certainly it's important to keep in mind that even though these are capable ports, they haven't been turned up for service yet. And there's a high likelihood that not 100% of these ports will get turned up for 25 gig services. However, it's important to keep in mind that with combo optics, with combo line cards, the roadmap for operators to move from a GPON to XGS to 25 gig or even 50 gig and 100 gig, it's very clear. And the vendors, I think, have done an excellent job of giving operators a real clear path without significant impact on their optical distribution networks, and without a tremendous impact on how these new bandwidth tiers and services are operationalized. They have a roadmap in front of them that allows them to grow and expand. Certainly for the 25 gig market, we see that more in the space of business services. And in fact, I expect to see quite a number of announcements along these lines where operators begin to deploy 25 gig for an Ethernet replacement type service for business customers as they expand their fiber networks, ostensibly to support both residential and business class customers. So this will be an interesting technology, of course, and an interesting market to continue to watch. Next slide, please. So, I also, since I cover the cable market as well, I figured I'd show just, what's going on in the cable space. A lot of participants here view them as competitive. Some have cable plant themselves and are figuring out what to do with that if DOCSIS 4.0 isn't on the table. And so it's really interesting to look at cable kind of being in a similar position to some fiber providers right now, in the sense that the upgrade of their infrastructure is happening, and you can see that in the form of new remote PHY devices, as well as corresponding virtual CMTS licenses to support the service groups that are now supported in or by remote PHY units. Obviously, the benefit here for cable operators that are deploying this remote PHY and virtual CMTS architecture is improved signal quality, reduced modulation error ratios or improved modulation error ratios, and just if they're adding more bandwidth through mid splits and high splits, they're inevitably going to do that in conjunction with these remote PHY deployments because of the additional bandwidth and signal quality improvements that they get. So that's continuing on. The challenge, of course, as we've all heard, especially here in the North American market for cable operators, is subscriber growth or net subscriber additions are extremely slow right now. You know, some of that has to do with fiber competition, of course, but a lot of it also has to do with the fixed wireless providers. That's continuing to have an impact. So, you know, you have a similar situation where the operators are updating and improving their infrastructure, while at the same time the subscriber growth numbers are continuing to come down here over the last few quarters in the last year. And so it's kind of an interesting conundrum for a lot of operators, and you know, certainly it's important to keep in mind that a lot of the remote PHY and VCMTS purchases are being driven by larger North American Tier 1 operators at this point. So, you know, it's a bit more difficult for the smaller operators to get their hands on this equipment at the moment. Certainly, supply chains will ease up just as they have in other areas. But again, this kind of dilemma that many operators are facing is similar here in the cable space. Well, let's go to the next slide, please. So, you know, as a result, the cable operators, particularly in North America, continue to expand their own fiber deployments, whether that's in overbuild scenarios, certainly in greenfield scenarios. It's almost unheard of at this point for a cable operator to deploy new coax in a greenfield environment. But also most definitely in these edge out programs. We certainly see this with Charter and its RDOF build out, where they're using remote OLT and cabinets to basically build off of the existing DOCSIS footprint they have, but then moving into the unserved and underserved area using fiber with a remote OLT that has the same footprint and form factor as a traditional optical node. And so we continue to see this as a really important platform going forward for cable operators as they make their transition to fiber and want to do so at an kind of an incremental pace, you know, without having to necessarily throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of their existing HFC plant. And really, you know, these purchases by you know, Tier 2 and Tier 3 MSOs here, specifically in the North American market, are really just beginning. We've just scratched the surface of this particular form factor being used in those type of deployments. So I fully expect that moving forward, this is how many cable operators are going to expand their own fiber footprint in their serving areas. Well, thank you very much. Certainly, I'm happy to answer any questions at this time.
Mia, can you slide back to slide 8? Yeah, so I just wanted to hit some things on some of your slides here, Jeff, if you don't mind. All right, so you know, we'll go back to slide 7, right? So you're saying that, hey, everything's looking good in the first half, you know, record pace like last year, and then go to slide 8, and then you're saying one more, yeah, there you go. You know, we're looking at a dip. So but you have kind of the ONTs and OLTs kind of dipping at an equal measure, it looks like there.
Mhm.
So wouldn't the ONTs, if you have a robust, second half of 2022 was a record on ONT shipments, and then we also had a strong first half, wouldn't the ONTs, since they're lagging at least a quarter, be more robust than this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and it's probably worthwhile showing this chart in the form of units and port shipments. What's going on here, if you look at it just from a revenue perspective, the ONTs actually, I think the total revenue is expected to decline by 16%, right? OLT revenue still only dropping from about 7% from 2022, and so you're still having the infrastructure go in place, and I think companies are still or operators are purchasing again to manage their own inventory, as well as they have their strategic initiatives. They know how many homes they still want to have passed, so the OLTs are a safer bet at this point. ONTs are impacted a lot by availability still. I think in addition to the lack of subscriber growth, I think there is also a desire to wait for lower cost units. And as we get new cycles and new spins of ONTs, each successive generation brings with it a reduced ASP. However, there's this period that operators can wait while they focus on attacking new areas and putting in new infrastructure, and then buying the ONTs later. So if you look at my 2024 numbers, you'll see that the ONT growth far outpaces what we're looking at for OLTs, because the focus now is still on the infrastructure and building out the networks, as opposed to turning up the subscribers.
Thanks, Jeff. May I go to the next slide? So you're talking about XGS PON. Is this XGS? Mm-hmm. Right. So XGS PON, so the green part, is growing like crazy. At what point does 25 gig PON start to show up on these graphs?
I mean, it really will start to show up a little bit as a sliver this year. And I expect that 2024 and 2025 will show gradual improvements. It's still difficult. I keep running into operators who have the capability of deploying 25 gig, and certainly their plan is to use it for business services. And that's been a consistent message that I've received from operators. And there will be high-end residential deployments, don't get me wrong, but I really think that it's going to be 24, 25, 26 that we'll see the continued growth using 25 gig as an option for those business services. So
what vendors are shipping 25 gig PON now? I know Nokia is definitely.
Right, it's really Nokia at this point, and I think they probably have some other announcements that are imminent, waiting for other vendors in the MSA that will be supplying equipment, particularly ONTs. I mean, I think that's a gating factor at the moment. Certainly, you want to have a pretty robust, vendor ecosystem when it comes to the ONTs.
Mia, can you go to slide 10? And this is where you're talking about. So you have GPON, XGS PON again on the ONT side. Mm-hmm. So one thing, I think you mentioned this during your discussion there, is that vendors using GPON ONTs and then upgrading to put XGS infrastructure in, so you have 10 gig symmetric, but not going with the XGS ONTs until you need, someone's looking for a 10 gig service. So Correct. Wouldn't that kind of artificially hold up the GPON ONTs?
It certainly is, and that's why you continue to see so many GPON ONTs being deployed relative to the the infrastructure that's being deployed to support XGS. So it is almost, and the unit costs for GPON ONTs tend to be relatively inexpensive at this point. So in some of the discussions I've had, the operators don't necessarily view, running the infrastructure at GPON line rates currently as sunk costs. They feel that when they're ready to upgrade to XGS across their entire systems, with the purchases of those ONTs, they'll be happy to do so. But they don't have to amortize the cost of the GPON ONTs over an extended period of time because they're relatively inexpensive right now.
All right, thanks, Jeff. May I go to the DAA transition slide? And this, I just wanted to make some clarity for, there you go.
Yep.
Since it's a little hard to read on the screen here, but, and I know the cable industry likes a lot of hand-wavy terms. So can you maybe, for our audience, just briefly explain mid splits and high splits, and also what's the real landscape? Cable labs, everybody touts 4.0, but I had to order cable the other day, and I'm only getting 10 meg upstream on their super duper gigabit service. So what's going on?
Yeah, so mid splits and high splits are both forms of what's called band splitting, right? Where that is an attempt to take care of the issue that you're facing and a lot of subscribers face, which DOCSIS was designed to from the get-go to be an asymmetric protocol and technology. And as fiber and as we have all needed more upstream bandwidth, cable operators are responding by changing how the bandwidth that they deliver and how the spectrum that they deliver is allocated between the upstream and the downstream. So a mid split will take anywhere. Current low split is a 5 to 42 megahertz for the upstream. Mid split will take that to 85 megahertz, right? So in theory, an almost doubling of the upstream speed. And then high split will take it to 200 to 4 megahertz, so even more bandwidth on the upstream side as well, without diminishing the downstream capabilities. So you'll start to see more operators roll out a 2 gig down and a 200 meg type service, but it isn't really until you get to DOCSIS 4.0 that you can get symmetric or near symmetric speeds that some customers want. So it's and certainly not all operators and certainly not all regions plan to move forward with DOCSIS 4.0. In fact, most European operators will stick with the DOCSIS 3.1 high split for the time being, and then largely move to fiber from there. North America is really where DOCSIS 4.0 will be predominant among the largest operators. But even among those operators, they do have strategies to incorporate more fiber. And the interesting thing is, historically, cable, from the managed subscriber management and routing perspective, with a traditional integrated CMTS, was designed for a cable modem. And now with the virtual CMTS and virtual BNG architectures, they can treat the fiber subscribers and ONTs very similarly and manage them very similarly to a cable modem. So that gives them some more flexibility that they've never really had in the past.
All right, well, Jeff, this is great stuff. So some of the questions that come in are, beyond sales, what insights, are available about actual deployment numbers? I mean, if I was to net this out from listening to you, it sounds like this year is a little bit of an anomaly as we do inventory drawdowns, but what's, kind of the future look like?
Yeah, it's interesting. We revised our 5-year forecast back in July. And this was before the Q2 numbers came in, but I'd had conversations with the vendors and operators as well about what the rest of the year looked like. and they all said the same thing: inventory digestion, inventory drawdown. Okay, that's understandable. Our 5-year forecast hasn't changed. It's a blip this year and maybe impacts the first quarter of next year. However, there's at that point, I think we get back to a situation where there's pent-up demand, and certainly when you hit 2025 with BEAD funding beginning to flow through to the equipment vendors, that ticks things back up to the point where, again, 2023 will certainly look like the anomaly on this continuous growth trajectory that we've seen over the last couple of years.
Well, Jeff, again, you always have so much great information. Really appreciate all your research and industry insights. And of course, it was great seeing you a couple weeks ago in person in Orlando. So thanks for joining us today. And I look forward to getting back together next Wednesday for Five for Breakfast. We'll be kicking off the first of our Five for Breakfast episodes on the Quantum series with Dr. Duncan Earl, the co-founder and president and CTO of Cubatech, where he'll be discussing quantum technology, what it is, and why it will soon matter. So you're not going to want to miss that. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you guys next Wednesday.